everyone, and welcome tonight for our conversation on clearing the air. Are electric vehicles actually better for our health? We'll begin today with a land acknowledgement. Of course, I did not introduce myself. My name is Jaden, and I am a summer student here at Emerge. And to do the land acknowledgement today, I will be speaking to you about the land that Guelph resides, because that's where I am. If you're not in Guelph, I encourage you to explore your relationship to the colonial history that has shaped your place and what actions you can take in your community to uplift and empower the Indigenous peoples whom have cared for, tended, and respected these lands since time immemorial. The city of Guelph resides on the lands of the Attawandaron peoples and the territories and the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. The city of Guelph is uniquely positioned on territories that are recognized within the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, and this is an Indigenous citizenship law made between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations in around 1701, extending from Montreal to Fort Erie. It has three basic rules that I would encourage everyone to consider in their daily lives and actions. The first, take only what you need, then leave some for everyone else, and keep it clean. The work that we do here at Emerge is to fight climate change, but we do this in a variety of ways, such as helping households in Guelph to lessen their impacts on the environment in an attempt to encourage families and households to keep it clean, whether that be through energy use or water use. All the lands of Turtle Island are steeped in rich Indigenous history, teachings, and truths from coast to coast to coast, and it is both our duty and our responsibility as settler Canadians to educate ourselves on the ongoing impacts of settler colonialism and colonial violence that occur every day here. I'd encourage everyone today to take some time to learn about the history and the current systemic issues that are impacting Indigenous peoples today, tomorrow, and every day until their treaty rights are recognized, respected, and enforced. Thank you. And now I will be handing the presentation over to Evan Ferrari, the Executive Director of Emerge.
Thanks, Jaden, and for that wonderful land acknowledgement. I really appreciate the effort, how serious you are and the effort that you put into that land acknowledgement. It's very important. I'm going to just quickly go through a few things here to put some context to the night. Some of you already know this, but as Jaden mentioned, that our main goal is to fight climate change. And I just briefly want to talk about two upcoming events. And really all I'm going to give you on this is a bit of a teaser. We have two events remaining this year, and we're going to be really cryptic about this. The first one is something salty, and you should be hearing about that one next week. And the second one is something spicy. And I'm going to leave that with you, and you're just going to have to keep your eyes open for those next two events that are coming up. The context for this evening is all about climate change, and on that note, we just want to remind people that the City of Guelph has two climate change specific goals. The first one is to achieve 100% renewable energy within the corporation of the City of Guelph by 2050. The second one is to also reach net zero carbon within the entire city, not just the corporation with the government, but the entire city of Guelph by 2050. And current council also acknowledges that the climate emergency exists. So those are sort of three main pieces. But having said that, we don't think it's enough. And that we feel that we need to take this to the next step. That was the first thing, was getting those targets. The next step is that we need to adopt yearly targets towards the 100% renewable, yearly targets towards that net zero carbon. And we must accomplish these goals much earlier than the 2050 date. And we've also got to demand positive climate action from the province on phasing out of fossil fuel burning for electricity. And an interesting, this is so new that something has just come up, that the city's going through an official plan review. And I know that sounds horribly boring for most of you, that official plans sound like, something you'd rather wash your hair than have to be involved with the official plan. But communities across the province are looking at entrenching specific items related to climate change within the official plans. So in the next couple of weeks, we're going to attempt to see if we can't leverage some of that into the review process that's coming up. So briefly, to put the context that we're in today from a transportation perspective, is that this is your eMERGE masterclass on transportation planning in one slide. And the icons are relevant to the greatest priority that we have to put out there. You'll notice pedestrians, and these are not only environmental goals, but they're also economic and social goals as well. That if we take this approach, the benefits are quite profound. The least cost by looking at changing our planning paradigm so that we can walk to most places, that we can bike to most places. We also need to make consideration for electric bicycles. Then the next priority would be public transit and electrifying public transit. And at the same time, looking at more cleaner burning fuels on the side of commercial vehicles, and then finally private vehicles. We always like to start with this master plan. So you've now graduated with a master's in eMERGE Transportation Management, by the way. But we always like to start with this one to put context to it. Regardless of all this, most of those first three items take a really long time to get to. But what we know in the city of Guelph is that 8,000 new vehicles are bought every year. A very tiny proportion of them are electric. As much as we'd like everybody to walk and to cycle and take public transit, what we know is that for the foreseeable future, those vehicles are going to be sold, and we want to make sure that we can get as many of them to be EVs. And finally, all of the work that we've been doing on EVs has been primarily focused on you people that we consider early environmental adopters. And what we've been attempting to do throughout this is to try to reduce the barriers to EV adoption. And your first presenters tonight are going to talk about some of those barriers, specifically for those that are very interested in the environment. And we see three specific areas. Tonight we're looking at the health implications of EV adoption, but there are two others that we're not going to address tonight, but we will be in a later webinar, and that's a cradle to grave analysis. And essentially that is to analyze what's the implication of an electric vehicle from the time you buy it to the time that it winds up going to that parking lot in the sky, all of the inputs that go into it, including fuel, comparing it to an electric vehicle. Then the last one is the social justice side of it that has become louder and louder. It's very interesting because it's popping up on an awful lot of fossil fuel sites. It's definitely something that we need to consider. And we're going to be bringing in speakers on both of those in the coming future, and I strongly recommend that you keep an eye out for those early in the new year. And on that note, I want to introduce my colleague Rasha, who is going to introduce our first speakers. Over to you, Rasha.
Thanks, Evan. Good evening, everyone. I'm so delighted to introduce our speakers for tonight. I will start by introducing our two speakers who are joining us together from the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute. Our first speaker is Brianna Wilson, who is a PhD student studying applied social psychology at the University of Guelph. Since May 2019, Brianna has worked at the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute as a graduate student and research assistant. She is passionate about conducting applied research that is useful for community organizations to mobilize and make positive social change, including her focused research on violence prevention against women and community-based research practices. And with Brianna, Patricia Butt is joining us from the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute. Patricia is a research assistant at the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute. She is a graduate student in the Rural Planning and Development Program at the University of Guelph. Please welcome with me, Brianna and Patricia. Over to you, ladies.
Hey, thank you, Rasha. Yeah, so we are a part of the Research Shop, which is a part of the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute at the University of Guelph. And we conducted this project at the request of and in partnership with eMERGE. So the purpose of this research was to better inform eMERGE's initiatives that promote renewable energy technologies, and more specifically, electric vehicles. And we also wanted to understand the perceived incentives and barriers to purchasing electric vehicles in the city of Guelph. So before we started the research project, it was important to do a review of the existing literature in the area and understand what's already been identified as benefits and barriers to EV ownership. So in regard to benefits, the top advantage found among EV owners and transportation experts was the environmentally friendly nature of EVs and their role in reducing harmful carbon emissions. Owners and experts also noted that EVs have a better performance than gas-powered vehicles, such as less noise and better acceleration. The innovative look and style of EVs was also found to be an advantage in previous research. And then another notable benefit of EV ownership was the decreased maintenance requirements and lower operating costs, which saves money over time. So turning to the barriers to electric vehicles, the most significant concern mentioned in the literature was by potential buyers and experts was the high initial cost of purchasing an EV, which was a large deterrent for many people. And the safety and the performance of the battery was also noted as a barrier because it doesn't perform as well in the winter and in heat. And there are safety concerns if one were to get into an accident. And related to the battery, many people expressed issue with charging time and lack of widespread charging station availability. And the range of the battery was also noted as a barrier for those who drive long distances, as well as the eventual cost of battery replacement. And then lastly, some people expressed concern around a lack of model diversity, which means a lack of diverse prices and functionalities. So we worked with Emerge to create surveys and distribute them across their networks through webinars and newsletters and the Guelph Today news outlet. So in total, 299 members of the Guelph community took the survey online. And the survey was split into 4 versions depending on whether the respondent owned an EV or if they were interested in purchasing one in the future. And so the 4 survey types were own a new EV with 70 respondents, own a used EV with 17, interested in purchasing an EV with 112, and not interested in purchasing or unsure with 100. And all 4 surveys collected demographic information, asked about interest in the environment and zero emission vehicles, as well as asked participants to provide their thoughts on different benefits and barriers to EV ownership. So specifically, the respondents were asked to rank how much they agreed or disagreed that certain barriers and benefits, which we found in the literature, were concerns for them when they were purchasing or considering purchasing an EV. And they were also provided with space to discuss their thoughts in open-ended questions.
Great, so now I'll just give a brief highlight over the demographics that we found from the collection of surveys. So in the gender category, the majority of our respondents for the survey were identified as men overall across the 4 different survey types. The majority who owned an EV, whether that was new or used, were also men at 67%. Across all 4 different surveys, there was quite a range of participants from 24 age to 65 plus. In the education category, the majority of participants had an undergraduate degree or above. In terms of income, all of the participants who owned an EV made a minimum of $50,000 to $100,000. And in terms of household, the majority of participants had a household of 2 or more adults without children. So just getting into the results, as Brianna mentioned, primarily the results that we're looking at here were the ranking that was done from the participants, whether they strongly agreed to strongly disagreed across the spectrum. So first of all, starting out with an interest in the environment and zero emissions vehicles, the majority of participants across all surveys were strongly interested or interested in environmental issues. And EV owners specifically expressed a strong interest in zero emissions vehicles. And those who weren't interested or unsure about EVs were also neutral about were also unsure about their interest in zero emission vehicles. Looking at the results in terms of the benefits of EVs overall, we asked about less maintenance, whether that was a benefit to EVs, and the majority of EV owners and those interested strongly agreed that this reduction in maintenance was an advantage. In terms of the positive environmental impact across all 4 surveys, participants agreed that this was a benefit. And in terms of looks and style, the majority of EV owners agreed that this was a benefit when considering purchasing, and close to half of the participants who were interested or unsure were neutral on this issue. In terms of saving money over time, the majority of EV owners, whether that's new or used owners, and those who were interested said that saving over time was a benefit. And investing in green companies And as opposed to investing in fossil fuels, the majority of new EV owners and those who are interested in EVs agreed that this was a benefit. Close to half of the used owners agreed that most of 30% were neutral about this factor. We'll just turn it over to Brianna to discuss the results of the barriers section.
Yeah, so overall, we found that across all 4 surveys, so again, those who owned an EV, those who were interested, and those who were not interested, respondents agreed that the high initial cost of EVs was a concern for them. For instance, those who bought used pointed to their affordability when asked why they had chose to purchase used over new. And the lack of a government incentive or rebate was also mentioned a lot by participants as a limiting factor for them. And those who were not interested in purchasing an EV also asserted that they believed that the high initial cost would not pay off over time. When asked about safety concerns, those who owned an EV and those who were interested in purchasing one disagreed that safety was a concern, so safety was not a concern for them. Though among those who were not interested in purchasing, opinions were mixed, so some agreed and some disagreed. And when prompted, one participant in this group expressed concern with how quiet EVs are, which is a significant issue for those with a visual impairment. In regard to battery range, respondents across all 4 surveys agreed that battery range was a concern for them. Among EV owners specifically, these concerns largely related to issues with charging away from home, such as on longer road trips, and having less range in the winter and in heat. And among those interested in purchasing an EV, extending the range of EVs was mentioned as a top factor that would push them to buy an EV. And they mentioned that a range close to 300 kilometers would meet their needs. And when respondents were asked if they were concerned about charging time, about half of all participants agreed that charging time was an issue for them. So for example, those who owned an EV discussed the extra planning that's required when they embark on long road trips. So needing to consider if a charging station is convenient, so no waiting or walking, if it's cost effective with no excessive fees, and if it accounts for risk. So if there's only one place to charge, what will they do if it doesn't work? So related to charging time, another barrier among the participants was charging station availability away from home. And across all 4 surveys, most participants agreed that this was a concern for them. EV owners went on to discuss the lack of stations across Ontario, especially in more rural areas, and a lack of charging stations in condos, on street levels, at workplaces, and hotels. And participants who did not own an EV also expressed concern around the high cost of fee-based charging stations. When asked if there were any concerns around a lack of model diversity, opinions were mixed among those who owned EVs and those who did not, with some agreeing and some disagreeing. But when they were asked to expand, respondents expressed issue with a lack of power and space, no reliable towing capacity, and no larger models to accommodate children or pets. And battery replacement concerns were also expressed specifically among those who owned a used EV, those interested in purchasing, and those who were not interested in purchasing. They were worried about battery degradation over time, the cost of eventual replacement, and the negative environmental impact of battery disposal. And then lastly, those who did not own an EV discussed concerns around the potential negative environmental impact of EVs. Specifically, a few participants noted concerns around the extraction methods for obtaining the raw materials for EV batteries, and that the mining practices were damaging to the environment. Another participant mentioned that although EVs do not directly burn fuel, power plants still rely on fossil fuels to generate electricity. And then some participants emphasized that the batteries were made in unethical conditions, with one participant noting, and this is a quote, "There's no guarantee that there's a positive environmental impact from electric vehicles. It's not cut and dry that buying electric equals investing in green companies."
Great, so just to summarize the results, overall our findings found that the results of our survey aligned with what had been found in previous studies. And while the majority of participants did express strong interest in environmental issues, many participants who were unsure or not interested in EVs were concerned about the negative environmental impacts and their batteries. And across all of the different themes, in terms of barriers, the 2 most prominent concerns were the financial incentives, more specifically looking at government rebates and subsidies, especially for those who are interested in EVs, and that was morally to do to the fact that to offset the initial high cost of EVs. And some participants noted that this should also be extended to used EVs as well as new. And the other major concern that we found across the major participants that we looked at was the charging access and infrastructure. So looking at access, especially for those who were condo owners or renters, in infrastructure in terms of availability within the city, but also for longer road trips outside of urban areas. So that wraps it up for our presentation. Just want to thank everybody for their time. And if there are any further questions, they can always follow up with Karen Nelson, who is our research shop coordinator. So now we'll just hand it over to Rasha.
Thank you, Patricia. What an interesting result emerged. We will be hosting a series of events for the EVs, especially addressing the environmental impact on EVs. So stay tuned. Now to the next speakers, who are Helen Doyle and Laura Ment. Helen Doyle is the chair of the Environmental Health Work Group affiliated with Ontario Public Health Association. Helen works with public health partners to promote and advocate for action on environmental health issues, including climate change, air quality, water quality, housing, built and natural environments, and children's environmental health. Helen is a certified public health inspector and retired from York Region Public Health in 2018, following a very rewarding and exciting 30-year career in environmental health and public health management. Currently, she is a board member of the Ontario Public Health Association Board of Directors. Helen is also on the board of directors for the Windfall Ecology Center, which is a not-for-profit organization that delivers environmental programs dedicated to building sustainable communities in York Region and Toronto. I will also introduce Laura Minute, which is a PhD candidate in transportation engineering and a postdoctoral fellow in civil engineering and earth sciences at the University of Toronto. Laura works on a variety of projects ranging from the presence of chemical compounds in food packaging to the impacts of traffic emissions on urban air quality, population exposure, and health. She is passionate by the issues related to the environment and thrilled to be part of the Da Vinci Engineering Enrichment Program, as it gives her the opportunity to share her passion for science and engineering. In her spare time, Laura likes hiking, camping, and traveling. Please welcome with me Helen Doyle and Laura Minute. Thanks for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Rash. And this is Helen, and Laura's going to be moving the slides for me. Hopefully that won't be too disruptive. So thanks for joining us this evening as we share some of the work that we did, some of the partners here, to look at how electric vehicles and cleaner trucks can reduce pollution, improve health, and save lives in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. So I would ask that you also, the website is there, clearingtheair.ca, just maybe take a look at that, because there's lots of interactive maps, and there's our larger report. We can only present so much this evening, but there's lots of information there that you can refer to as well. So in the next slide, just a little bit more about our project team. So this is the project team, and this project itself was a collaboration between Environmental Defence, the Ontario Public Health Association, and the University of Toronto's Transportation and Air Quality Research Group. And we came together because we wanted to build more evidence for action to reduce the health impacts of both air pollution and climate change, recognizing that transportation is a major source of air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions that both contribute to health impacts. So this evening you're going to hear from Laura and myself. Sarah Buchanan is our policy implications expert, but she's quite busy this evening with a new baby. So I'm going to be doing a little bit about the policy implications, but if you have any further questions, there's lots more details in our report, and we can get answers for you later if we don't have them tonight. So the agenda, I'll just give you a second to take a look at that, but I'll just kind of move on. This is what we're going to be talking about this evening. So how can cleaner vehicles improve health and fight climate change in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area? starting with the next slide, I'll just give you an overview of some of the highlights from our report. So our modeling shows that switching to electric vehicles, electric transit buses, and cleaner trucks will dramatically reduce traffic-related air pollution. So these maps show nitrogen dioxide levels from an average day on the left, and some of the scenarios that were modeled by Laura and the research team at U of T. Maybe just going to the next slide, it'll be a little bit easier to see where we have nitrogen dioxide concentrations again, that the map on the left is an average day of nitrogen dioxide concentrations in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. And on the right is the scenario if 100% of cars and SUVs in this area, Greater Toronto Hamilton area, were electric. So you can see where on the left-hand side, and again on the right, there is that, so this one is showing transit buses, cars, transit buses, and the next one is trucks. And you can take a look at these maps on our website, but it's just showing how as we look at these various scenarios, we are reducing the amount of nitrogen dioxide concentrations in like ambient concentration. So we'll go on to show you how that this is other things that we identify for improving health. So in this slide, we are showing that the improvements to air quality will lead to health benefits for residents, namely preventing hundreds of premature deaths. For example, the modeling showed that switching to 100% electric cars in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area would prevent 313 premature deaths per year across the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. So this graph breaks it down by municipality, the 6 municipalities in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area, and then also by scenario. So as you can see, the green bars, obviously we get the biggest benefit if 100% of cars and SUVs are electric. The second biggest benefit in premature deaths was the trucks that met newer technology. So it wasn't modeling electric trucks, but it was more modeling newer technology that meant that there was cleaner emissions. And finally, the other component, we certainly wanted to look at greenhouse gas reduction. So our modeling showed that switching to electric vehicles, electric buses, and more efficient trucks would also dramatically reduce greenhouse gases and help slow the impacts of climate change. So for example, if every car in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area was electric, would reduce carbon pollution from transportation in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area by nearly 70%. And that's 8 megatons every year, which works out to approximately half of Ontario's commitment to, or their carbon targets for 2030. So if you go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the research that I did on looking at traffic-related air pollution and the health benefits. And the reason why the OPHA, the Ontario Public Health Association, we were so interested in being involved in this project because two of our areas of focus are environmental health, the work group that I chair, and we also have a health equity work group. And we recognize from the research that air quality improvements are going to lead to health improvements, and also they're going to benefit from a health equity perspective. And some of this work also helps support a new campaign that we launched at OPHA, Make It Better. It's a health-focused climate communication campaign, and we talk about some of this air quality benefits too from climate actions that can also improve health. And the public health units across Ontario are mandated under the Ontario Public Health Standards to deliver programs. One of them is the Healthy Environments Program, and one of the program standards in there talks about reducing exposure to health hazards in the natural and built environment. And the next bullet there, I think, is so important and relevant to this study, is one of the mandates is to use data to influence and inform the development of healthy public policy. So Evan mentioned early on about official plans and transportation planning policies. So health units across Ontario over the last several years have been using evidence, health evidence, to inform and help develop policies in regional official plans, local official plans, and transportation planning policies. And one of them, when I was working at York Region Public Health, certainly we were promoting active transportation, but also sustainable transportation, such as electric vehicle charging stations to make it more easy for cleaner vehicles. And also another is inequities is another requirement. So that brings us to the health evidence that informed the background to some of this, our report. So in the next few slides, I'm going to present a bit of information from Health Canada's Health Impacts of Air Pollution in Canada report. So this report identified, the bottom line is that even though there's improvements in air quality across Canada, and we hear that there's improvements every year, air pollution continues to have serious impacts to population health. 14,600 deaths every year attributed to air pollution in Canada, 3,000 of those in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area, 2.7 million asthma symptom days every year, 35 million acute respiratory symptom days, 42,000 child acute bronchitis episodes, and thousands of hospital admissions and emergency department visits due to cardiac and respiratory conditions. So these impacts are based on exposure to 3 pollutants: fine particulate matter, nitrogen dioxide, and ozone. And these 3 pollutants account for the majority of health impacts from air pollution. They're linked to a range of conditions: respiratory, cardiovascular conditions, and lung cancer. Specifically, exposure to fine particulate matter, the Health Canada's research that 9,700 deaths are attributed to exposure to fine particulate matter in Canada every year. The health outcomes are cardiovascular and respiratory disease and cancers. And one of the very important things to note is that even at very low concentrations, so while we hear maybe air quality is improving, even at very low concentrations, we're seeing adverse health impacts. So it's important that we continue to get air pollution down as low as possible. The populations most affected by exposure to fine particulate matter are children with asthma, older adults, and people with existing heart and lung conditions. And Laura will talk a little bit more about this later, but black carbon is a major component of fine particulate matter, and diesel engines are the main source. When it comes to nitrogen dioxide, 9,400 premature deaths from exposure to nitrogen dioxide in Canada every year. The health outcomes associated with it are related to respiratory conditions, and similar to fine particulate matter, long-term exposure to even low levels increases the risk of developing breathing problems, and the populations most sensitive are those with asthma, allergies, and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And later on, Laura's going to be showing you some of the slides about the emissions from transportation. You're going to see the term nitrogen oxides, whereas earlier on I showed in the slide nitrogen dioxide concentration. So the reason why there's the discrepancy there is because the concentrations that we're seeing in the atmosphere, nitrogen dioxide, but the nitrogen oxides, which is the emissions, are rapidly converting to nitrogen dioxide. And it's so important that we address transportation sources because it's the leading source of NOx emissions in Ontario. And our third pollutant, ozone, is responsible for 4,000 deaths every year in Canada. And there's another range of health outcomes, including exacerbation of asthma, shortness of breath, other respiratory irritants. And the population's most sensitive, once again, people with underlying respiratory conditions. Ground level ozone is a secondary pollutant, so it's formed from some of the emissions from transportation sources, as you'll see in a minute. So the next slide, health risk is a factor both of sensitivity and of exposure. So people that are more sensitive to air pollution are older adults, young children, people with existing heart or lung conditions, and people with diabetes. And we know that people experiencing inequities are more likely to be living with existing medical conditions, which puts them at greater risk from air pollution. Those with greater exposure to air pollution are those that are active outdoors and those that live near industries or high traffic corridors. Which brings us to the evidence for traffic-related air pollution. There's a significant body of evidence associating traffic pollution with adverse health outcomes, including premature deaths, respiratory health, cardiovascular health, and cancers. A study out of the city of Toronto in 2014 identified that almost 50% of premature deaths and hospitalizations due to air pollution emitted within Toronto were from traffic pollution. And a report in 2014 from medical officers of health in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area health units, approximately 1,000 premature deaths and 3,000 to 4,000 hospitalizations were from traffic-related air pollution. And from our report, from our research this year, our Clearing the Air report, traffic-related air pollution from trucks, cars, and buses responsible for 872 premature deaths in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area every year. So, well, more work needs to be done. Evidence from Canadian studies reveals that exposure to TRAP isn't equitably distributed, with people living closer to major roads more likely to be experiencing health inequities. So they're already experiencing inequities and more likely to be living close to busy roads, increasing their exposure. And lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods are often located in these areas. And a City of Toronto study in 2017 revealed that over 60% of long-term care homes, 50% of childcare centers, and about 40% of schools were located to busy roads. And for our Clearing the Air report, well, our modeling wasn't specifically able to show an association between traffic exposure, socioeconomic status, and inequities. We do know that because higher levels of TRAP is exposure to those experiencing inequities, we know that those people that are already exposed to higher levels will benefit the most from cleaner vehicles on the road. And just the final slide, as we hear daily updates from our Chief Health Officer, Dr. Tam, it was quite relevant on Clean Air Day in June, some of the statements that were put up by our Chief Health Officer about the link between people that already have underlying conditions are some of the most vulnerable to COVID and the most severe outcomes related to COVID. And we know as well that air pollution increases susceptibility to other viral respiratory infections. So, well, cities, when we saw this early in the lockdown, we saw that cities experienced a reduction in air pollution. So we know that isn't the solution we need. We do want to get more vehicles on the road, and it's a combination of sustainable transportation and active transportation options, but we do know that we need to also look at the emissions from vehicles, and certainly, as Laura will show in the next few slides, we've demonstrated this, I think, in our report. Thanks. Over to Laura.
All right, hi. So I'm Laura Minet, and so I'm part of the Transportation and Air Quality Research Group at the University of Toronto. And so now I'm going to discuss the modeling approach we've used for this study and present the main results of the report. So it's going to be a bit more technical, and so I try to make it easy to understand, but don't hesitate to ask me questions at the end. So our framework is developed around a chemical transport model that simulates the physical dispersion and the chemical reactions of air pollutants. It's a type of model that uses information on land use, meteorology, and emissions to simulate air pollutant concentrations, in our case, over a grid of 1 by 1 kilometer. So a quite fine spatial resolution. The emission inventory, which is the inventory of all types of emissions that occur over the region of study, is very important for this type of model. And so we need to have the most refined inventory possible to provide accurate results. So we need to take into account all possible sources of emissions, whether they're anthropogenic, such as power plants, traffic, industries, or agriculture. And we also need to take into account natural sources, such as vegetation. Since traffic is the largest source of emissions in cities, it's important to have a traffic emission inventory as detailed as possible. So in our case, we've used the results of a traffic assignment model that is based on travel survey data, and we've combined this information with emission factors to get an emission inventory for private passenger vehicles, transit buses, and commercial vehicles. And then to evaluate the impact of changes of air pollutant concentrations on human health, we've assessed the health outcomes associated with changes in air quality in terms of number of years of life lost and number of premature deaths. And finally, we've supplemented this assessment tool with an assessment with a basic economic valuation of the social benefits that are associated with these numbers of premature death prevented. So for this, we've used what we call a value of statistical life, or VSL, and it represents how much people are willing to pay to reduce the risk of death. So for instance, the VSL can include the wage premium required to attract employees to do dangerous work, or the willingness to pay for improved vehicle safety features. It captures the value of reduced risks of premature death, but it does not include healthcare costs. And so the economic valuation presented in our report is expected to actually underestimate the actual social benefits associated with improvements in air quality, because we don't take into account the healthcare costs. So the study area is the greater Toronto and Hamilton area, the GTHA, which houses about 7 million inhabitants and is divided into 6 regional municipalities. The GTHA is our area of focus because this is where in the transportation group at the University of Toronto, we've developed traffic demand modeling capabilities. The results here, unfortunately, do not cover Guelph, but it's obvious that improvements in air quality in the GTHA would be reflected around Guelph, and the push toward cleaner vehicles in the GTHA would certainly be mirrored in Guelph. Also important to note that the trucks and the cars, some of the trucks and cars that drive within the GTHA are also those that drive in Guelph. So first, we've developed a traffic emission inventory for cars and SUVs, trucks, and public transit buses. So on those graphs, the trucks are represented in yellow, and we see on the top left that they're responsible for more than half of the traffic-related nitrogen oxide, NOx, emissions in the GTHA, and cars and SUVs in orange are also responsible for a large amount of the NOx emissions. Trucks are the largest emitters of traffic-related fine particulate matter, PM2.5, and black carbon, and they represent more than 70% of these emissions. But it's really cars and SUVs that are responsible for the largest portion of greenhouse gas emissions. In general, public transit buses represent a small portion of the total traffic emissions, but they're important because they operate in densely populated areas. So the first question we explored concerned the health burdens of the different vehicle types. Wanted to see how we can get policies to target the vehicles that have the most impact on human health. So here, this map shows the years of life lost per 100,000 inhabitants that are attributed to each vehicle category. The red color shows the location with the highest number of years of life lost per capita. The population losing the most years of life due to private passenger vehicles on the left and commercial vehicles in the middle is located mainly along highways and around the airport. The region of Peel, which is known to have substantial truck traffic, is clearly affected by trucks, especially around the airport, because it draws in a lot of commercial vehicles. But the spatial distribution is a bit different for transit buses because they mainly drive in the city of Toronto. And so the population the most affected by emissions from buses lives in Toronto. I've also indicated on the graphs the total number of premature deaths that are induced by the emissions of each vehicle category. We see that all vehicles are responsible for a large number of premature deaths every year, but it's really trucks that are inducing the highest number of premature deaths. Tackling the emissions of cars and commercial vehicles would be most beneficial in terms of health effects, and reducing the emissions from cars would help decrease a large portion of the GHG emissions from the transportation sector. So here, using the number of cars and SUV driving in the GTHA, we've calculated that one car or SUV generates in its life about $10,500 of social costs. And for trucks, we've estimated that it's about $182,000 of social costs that can be attributed to each truck in the GTHA during its life. Why is it important to calculate such social costs? Mainly because it's an opportunity to elucidate the external costs of transport services. The economic valuations often neglects external costs, such as exposure to air pollution. And so here, this modeling work has provided a method to assess them. Here, this graph summarizes the annual social costs attributed to each vehicle type for each region. So the 3 regions the most affected are Toronto, Peel, and York, which is not surprising because these are the regions with the most important traffic, in particular Toronto and Peel for truck traffic. trucks are responsible for the largest social costs in all regions. Per capita, Toronto is the most affected, followed by Peel and York. And the distribution is the same for cars, but with the stronger difference between Toronto and Peel, which really highlights the large amount of private passenger traffic in the city of Toronto. And finally, in comparison, we can see that the transit buses induce lower social costs, but they still have a substantial impact, especially in Toronto. So renewing the fleets of on-road vehicles with cleaner vehicles is a way of reducing emissions of greenhouse gases and air pollutants, because more recent vehicles are usually more efficient. So here we've explored the health benefits associated with the renewal of different fleets of on-road vehicles. So to look at the impact of having cleaner vehicles on population exposure and health, we've considered a base case with only gasoline-fueled private cars and SUVs, diesel-fueled transit buses, and gasoline and diesel-fueled commercial vehicles. And then we've designed three main scenarios. So the first one is called 100% electric vehicles. So all private cars and SUVs are electric. The deployment of cars, electric cars, and SUVs is often seen as the best opportunity to reduce GHG emissions, because cars are responsible for the largest amount of GHG emissions. The second scenario is 100% electric buses. Even though buses are not responsible for large GHG and air pollutant emissions, it's often seen as a worthy investment because there are very few transit buses compared to the number of cars. In this scenario of transit bus electrification, as well as the previous one with electric vehicles, the exhaust emissions from electric vehicles were removed, but the electricity production from the nearby power plants was adapted to account for the additional electricity production for fueling the electric vehicles. And so in our scenarios, we've used the current electricity grid mix of Ontario. And finally, the third scenario we've explored is called cleaner trucks. So we've assumed that the trucks have recently been renewed and they're all younger than 8 years old. The rationale behind this choice is that there has been a dramatic improvement in air pollutant emissions in new trucks, but electric trucks are not yet a viable solution on a large scale. So here this graph shows the reductions in traffic-related greenhouse gas emissions achieved under each scenario. We see that deploying electric cars and SUVs will lead to the greatest reductions, with total GHG emissions about 2/3 lower than under the base case. And it's the case even when we consider the GHG emissions associated with the production of electricity, which is indicated on this graph in green. Having electric buses or cleaner trucks will have little impact on the total traffic-related GHG emissions, which is because trucks and buses are not responsible for a large portion of traffic-related GHG emissions. So here in this graph, we see the annual social benefits that would be achieved with a complete deployment of electric cars and SUVs. We see proportionally greater social benefits for the residents in Toronto, Peel, and York regions, because the air quality of this region is the most affected by traffic emissions. 313 premature deaths would be prevented with this scenario, which is very close to the total number of premature deaths attributed to cars and SUVs. This corresponds to $2.4 billion per year in social benefits and a reduction of 7.6 megatons of GHG emissions per year. And this can be translated into almost $10,000 of social benefits obtained for the deployment of each electric car. And it's not only the electric vehicle owners that would benefit from an electrification of the vehicle fleet, but everyone living in the GTHA. Here on this slide are presented the results for the electric buses scenario. So the greatest benefits are for the residents of the city of Toronto, because this is where most buses circulate. All the premature deaths that were induced by emissions from transit buses would be saved with a complete deployment of electric buses. And this corresponds to $1.1 billion per year in social benefits. But there's only 0.3 megatons of GHG emission that would annually be saved under this scenario. And finally, here we have the results for the last scenario with cleaner trucks. The populations from the regions where truck traffic is concentrated would benefit from an improvement of air quality. The total number of premature deaths prevented under this scenario amounts to 175, and this is quite lower than the more than 400 premature deaths that are attributed to commercial vehicles in the region. And it's a case because here we've only replaced, renewed the existing diesel trucks with other diesel trucks. And so we're not completely removing the exhaust emissions. But this still corresponds to $2.1 billion per year in social benefits. Having cleaner trucks would have very little impact over the total traffic GHG emissions, however. So to put in perspective the results of the three scenarios, we've compiled maps of the social benefits per 100,000 inhabitants, and the core scheme is the same between the three maps. And you have at the bottom the GHG emissions saved daily under each of the three scenarios. So we see that the scenario with 100% electric cars and SUVs, which is on the left, and the cleaner truck scenario, which is on the right, would lead to similar health benefits. But it's electrifying the private household vehicles that is a lot more beneficial in terms of GHG emissions. The region of Toronto is always benefiting the most from the strategies implemented, but we also see that under the cleaner truck scenario, the region of Peel would greatly benefit from improvements in air quality. We've seen that tackling emissions from cars and trucks would lead to the biggest improvements in air quality and the biggest decreases in GHG emissions, but it's also important to target transit buses because they drive in highly populated zones. And finally, we've also modeled two scenarios of partial electrification of the cars and SUVs. So on the left, we have 20% electric vehicles, in the middle 50%, and on the right 100%. With low levels of electrification of the private vehicles, it's mainly the regions of Toronto and Peel that benefit from an improvement of air quality. And under the three different scenarios, the GHG emission savings are proportional to the level of electrification. A key finding of these comparisons is that under all these scenarios, replacing one car or SUV by an electric vehicle leads to about $10,000 of social benefits. So now I'll let Helen conclude this presentation with some notes on policy implications.
Thanks, Laura. Let's go to the next slide. So to get to 100% electric vehicles, we need much stronger policy tools that are in place now, or that are even planned in some of the federal commitments that have been made already. And as Brianna mentioned earlier on in her presentation, some of the barriers that in the surveys that you did, I certainly feel that these solutions can help address some of those barriers. So one example is a national zero emission vehicle mandate. And this would mean, and there are some provinces that have this now, is that automakers would have to sell an increasing percentage of vehicles would have to be zero emission vehicles. So that would require them to promote and to advertise zero emission vehicles more so than they're doing the trucks and SUVs now. And we know increasing greenhouse gases from the trucks and larger SUVs is certainly a concern. So this would be helpful. Other purchase incentives would help too, purchase incentives, so rebates. Another thing that's really important is we've got to make sure we maintain strong greenhouse gas efficiency standards for cars. And there's concern, the US EPA, that looking to weaken vehicle fuel efficiency standards, and as our fuel efficiency standards are tied to the US, that is a concern. And then just to mention, like all of these solutions, charging stations. So the range anxiety, I think that was mentioned at the beginning too in that survey. If there are more charging stations, that will help that. And we've heard some of the federal announcements in the last month or so about that. So we're hoping that we hear more about that in the future. And then just in the last slide, we looked at a couple of solutions, policy solutions for getting to cleaner trucks. So a scrappage program, and there are some jurisdictions that have this already, and this would allow fleet or vehicle owners, truck owners, to cash in vehicles, older, more polluting vehicles. Low emission zones, there are some areas, I think Europe and other areas where trucks aren't allowed to go into certain zones that are high polluting zones, so help to reduce emissions in that area. And also incentives for cleaner trucks, just like for electric vehicles. And finally, getting to 100% e-buses. Transit authorities, some transit authorities have committed to shifting to e-buses. So when they retire diesel buses, rather than purchasing a new diesel bus, they're committing to buying e-buses, and there are more manufacturing of e-buses, and in Canada as well. So those are some of the solutions. There's many more on our website, so maybe take a look at that at clearingtheair.ca. And finally, our acknowledgement page. I think we're running short of time, so we won't take too much time here, but we need to acknowledge some of the people behind this work who haven't been mentioned yet. Our advisory committee, there's a list of them here from many organizations, environmental groups, and public health organizations. It was a great team to work on this together. So thanks once again. That's it. There's lots of more information, and I don't know if we've had time for questions, but hopefully a few minutes. Thanks so much.
Great, thanks. Thanks both of you. This is quite remarkable, and frankly, the four of you have just knocked it out of the park in my mind. That I think the meshing of those of the research that both of you have done have fit really nicely together. I will say, just on reflection on the attitudes survey, I always find those ones interesting because it's attitude, it's not necessarily the reality. And one of the things that I grasped from that was that even people that have EVs talk about the problems when they're traveling from home, and that's somehow it's seen as a major issue, that we need charging stations on every corner, and yet over 90% of all driving is within less than 50 kilometers a day throughout Canada. And what that means is that 90% of your charging happens at home, and yet range anxiety continues to be something that's front and center. So that one I find very interesting. And then with Laura and Helen's presentation, the take-home one for me that I've been chatting with a number of people about this that really surprised me was that those that are affected the worst from a health perspective tend to be those that contribute the least to the problem in the first place. And that also means that by going down those scenarios that you've presented, that they will be the first to benefit, not necessarily the people that can afford electric vehicles that are out there. We did have one question right off the bat that I just want to touch on briefly. It's not relative specifically to the research, but Rafiq was asking about the source of the electricity, and I'm happy to deal with that question. But Helen or Laura, do you want to deal with that one, or would you like me to take it? Go ahead.
Sure, I can answer. So yeah, actually in our work, as I was mentioning, we've taken into account the emissions associated with the production of electricity for fueling the electric vehicles. So we've based our electricity production on the current grid mix of Ontario. So it's about 10% of electricity from natural gas power plants, and then a large portion is from nuclear, and there's hydro and also a bit of renewable. And so the main concern for air pollutant concentrations is natural gas power plants, because these are the ones that are emitting. And so when we've removed emissions, exhaust emissions from vehicles to model electric vehicles, we have increased emissions from power plants. And we've looked at their impact, the impact of these increased emissions on the ambient air quality. With only 10% of electricity produced by natural gas power plants, we see very little impact on the air pollution around the power plants. We've also look at an extreme scenario where all the electric vehicles would be fueled only by natural gas electricity. And in that case, we see deterioration of air quality around the natural gas power plants. But in general, overall, over the entire GTHA, we see a general improvement.
Helen, would you like to add to that?
No, that's Laura's explanation. That's great. Thanks, Laura.
If I could add a couple of tidbits on that, and one of the things that we were surprised to understand that in Ontario, by switching to an EV with the current mix, it's about 4 tons per vehicle that you're removing of CO2 emissions. And even when you compare that exact car being operated in a place like Alberta that's highly fossilized on the electricity side, there's still a net benefit on the CO2 and the health side. And now, granted, it's only 0.2 tons of CO2 compared to 4 tons in Ontario. And I'm glad, Laura, that you brought up the implication of, this was to Fareed's question, that the implication of then replacing all of that with natural gas. We also have better choices that unfortunately the government isn't interested in listening, and that is energy conservation and efficiency, renewables, and buying excess hydropower that's completely supported by the First Nations from Northern Quebec. So we have solutions to be able to mitigate even those things. Yes, it wouldn't be as good as it is today to go completely with natural gas, but we have real solutions to get there. Yeah, I'm curious, Laura and Helen, your thoughts, having seen the presentation before yours as well, how you see that meshing with what you've seen in other communities or in the research that you've been coming across as well.
Do you want to, do you have thoughts, Helen?
Yeah, sorry, Evan, can you repeat your question? I'm not sure if I...
I'm curious after you're hearing the presentation that Brianna and Patricia made about the attitudes, how that meshes with with what you've learned through all the work that you've done with your very in-depth report on the health side of things.
Well, what it makes me realize is that some of the solutions that were identified, like the policy implication solutions, are addressing exactly, to my mind, as I was listening to Brianna and Patricia's presentation, the barriers and the concerns that people have. And the other piece that I thought was kind of interesting is that to be asked the question, what do you think about the environmental impact of electric vehicles? Well, an environmental impact is a health impact. A climate impact is a health impact. And that's what I think we sometimes lose sight of. And that was one of the reasons why our organizations are so happy to work together. Like, we want people to understand that, yes, as if you're reducing emissions from vehicles, it's a climate action, but every climate action is an action for health. It's reducing air pollution, which is immediate health benefits. So I'm hoping this information, so the research that you did, your survey, plus our Clearing the Air report, both of these combined, I think, are excellent tools to advocate for local policies, for provincial policies, incentives, and at the federal level too. So we need more of this. It's great that we were able to work with UNT and the expertise they have, and that we're combining environmental and health groups together. So yeah, I think it'd be a great opportunity to look at this a little bit more detail.
And what's the reception been like to the report? I mean, I know it was released during on a Clean Air Day, and always releasing a report is always problematic because you don't know what other media event might take you off the table and take the attention away from all the media people. But I'm curious what kind of feedback that you're getting from decision makers, political or bureaucratic types.
So that might be a question to ask Sarah, because I know that she's been meeting with some various groups, and she's spearheading the calls about the policy implications. But certainly from my public health colleagues, we're very interested in this because, like I mentioned earlier on, we've been struggling over the last 10, 20 years to try and get attention paid to traffic-related air pollution and health. And we've been asked, by our local municipalities, well, where's the health evidence? So, they hear about physical activity and getting people more physically active, but the actual health evidence that shows, if you get more cars off the road and if you switch to cleaner vehicles, what is that number? Like, what's that number of lives you can save? So certainly my public health colleagues have appreciated this because they feel this is something they can take back to, as they provide input on official plans and transportation plans, they're going to be able to use this. So, yeah.
That's excellent.
And I think Laura said that there's more work at U of T, like that. Obviously, there's a whole traffic research and air quality division at University of Toronto. So I'm always excited to see the work that comes out of that group.
Yes,
and I have to say, sorry, go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, we're starting to do some project on looking at the impact of changes in behavior. So not only changing the technology of the vehicles, but also seeing the impact of changes in behavior. So using less cars, more public transit. How is this going to impact ambient air quality and population health?
There's another question from Rafiq here, and he talks about the question of cost being one of the barriers. And I'm glad that that in your policy and some of the suggestions that you had there, where you were talking about scrappage, and different kind of incentives. But Rafiq, there currently are two different types of incentives, financial incentives out there. One is a $5,000 rebate from the federal government, which isn't enough to make an electric vehicle to the same comparable price as its equivalent in an ICE or internal combustion engine. And then there's another one that's up to $2,000 through our friends at Plug and Drive. It's up to $2,000 for a used vehicle. And if you were to go onto Auto Trader and look at EVs there, you can buy an EV for under $15,000 and potentially get at least a minimum of $1,000 and maybe even $2,000. So it has started to become an aftermarket. There's a secondary market there, and that potentially has the opportunity to accelerate things, because people don't even think that there possibly could be a used market for these things. Got another question here. So Jaden says, it seems that logical action to take on the planning side of things is to increase public transit and make it more accessible to folks who would normally drive, add to air pollution. How can we as everyday citizens help to make these changes happen?
Oh, that's a good question, but I think everyone has to do their part. So as a citizen, I guess the first step is to yourself use more public transit and bike and walk around. And the more pedestrians and the more cyclists there would be on the roads, the more space that would be allocated to them. And we've seen that this summer, like the city of Toronto has implemented so many bike lanes because there was a real demand from the public. And I think that's the way we should move forward.
And I think to try and communicate the co-benefits, like there's so many co-benefits of active and sustainable transportation. And that's what we try to do in public health. Next week, we're relaunching our Make It Better campaign, our health-focused climate communication campaign. And in there, we trying to share things that people can do, solutions at the local level, things you can do individually, but also advocating for, when we talked about these policies, that talk to your local counselor to say, I want to buy an electric vehicle. Why isn't there one at the town hall? Like, if there was one there, maybe there'd be more incentives. So to talk about it for sure, I think is really important to do that and to educate yourself about it. So, yeah.
And there's a specific question here from Megan. She's asking if there are electric minivans and pickup trucks on the horizon. Megan, from our research, what we're seeing is that there is indeed a minivan out there. Chrysler has a Pacifica. It is a plug-in hybrid with a relatively small range of under 50 kilometers. However, most of your daily travel would be within that range, and then your gas engine would kick in. And also on the SUV side of it, yes, there are quite a number of them. And on the pickup side of things, the Rivian is a pickup truck that's about to hit horribly expensive. Tesla has announced their Cybertruck that will be coming out soon. Ford has announced their F-150. And Megan, I'm really glad that you brought this issue up, because one of the things that we've stumbled across through all of this is that small trucks, pickup trucks, vans, and SUVs have continued to become a larger total market of vehicles sold in Guelph and around the country. We did the stats locally as well. Fully 66% of all vehicles are large vehicles. And what happens as a result of that is that we're taking up more space with these things too, and they're considerably less fuel efficient. But all the companies have announced or on the verge of announcing that. We've got another question here for reference. What does a megaton of GHG mean in everyday language? Great question, Jill, thanks.
Well, I just looked up when I saw that question there in the report. So 8 megatons of greenhouse gases is equivalent to the output of 2 coal plants and about half the reductions needed to meet Ontario's 2030 carbon emission reduction targets. If that helps.
Yeah, if I could add another one on a different scale, Jill, the average home, including a car, is somewhere around 15 tons. So imagine if you got rid of a car, if you got rid of a car and bought an electric, so if you got rid of a gas vehicle and got an electric vehicle, you'd be down to about 11 tons from 15. So that's just to give you an idea. It's difficult because a ton or a volume or a weight of CO2, you can't see it, you can't touch it. It's kind of invisible. Glad you asked the question. Well, I can't thank you enough. I'm going to turn the podium over to, if you don't, any last thoughts? Sorry, Laura and Helen, any last thoughts before we sign off for the evening?
No.
Thank you for letting us present.
I'm going to hand the podium over to Jaden for a moment. Jaden, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. I just want to say a big thank you to our presenters tonight, but of course a big thank you to all of the folks for coming out. And if someone is tuning in after this presentation has taken place, thank you for watching it after it's happened. But I'll start by saying thank you to Brianna and Patricia from the University of Guelph for your presentation at the beginning about the Guelph perspectives on electric vehicles. As someone who's in Guelph but has never owned a vehicle, I'm always very curious if one day I chose to have a vehicle, what kind I would choose and why. And that survey actually helped me reflect a lot on my thoughts around vehicles and transportation. And it gave me just a lot to think about after filling it out, even though I don't have plans to buy a car for quite some time. So thank you for sharing that. It was really intriguing to see what the people of Guelph feel about electric vehicles. And then of course, a huge thank you to Helen and to Laura, as well as to your colleagues, Sarah and Marianne, for the information that you shared with us tonight. It was really cool to learn about sort of the emissions in the GTHA and how those could change moving forward, but also some of the actions that we can take as everyday citizens when it comes to our individual choices on vehicle ownership, on transportation, and of course on asking our representatives to take action for us. I hope that everyone was able to take away as much as I was from tonight and be able to put that into meaningful action moving forward in today's climate crisis, especially with COVID going around. So just wanted to thank all of you for coming out tonight. It was a great learning experience for all of us, and we are very grateful for you taking the time to share your knowledge with us.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Have a great night.
Thank you. Bye.